By now, you should be an expert on the New England colonies and the Middle colonies. When it came to the New England colonies, we learned about three reasons why the colonies became colonies and why people moved there. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Religion and politics and business, oh my. People wanted religious freedom, the freedom to follow whatever religion they wanted to follow. They didn't have that in England. And they didn't even have that once Massachusetts became a colony. People that lived there, you either followed the Puritan religion or get out. And so colonies were started because people wanted religious freedom, political freedom, the freedom to make rules and laws the way that you felt they should be made and followed. And of course, sometimes it's all about just money and business, like the starting of New Hampshire for the selling of lumber to make money. And if you lived in one of these New England colonies during this time period, you most likely lived in a New England village. These villages were self-sufficient. Basically, everything that someone needed or wanted on a day-to-day basis was right there in the village. You had all your businesses that surrounded the open grassy area, the common, everything that they needed. They grew most of what they needed themselves in terms of food. These villages were self-sufficient. But as you look into the middle colonies were formed for very different reasons, and life was very different if you lived there. The why really all has to do with Pennsylvania. William Penn, a Quaker, got permission to start this colony, basically to pay back the debt that King Charles II owed to William Penn's father. But King Charles II also said, hey, when you go over there to start this colony of Pennsylvania, bring all your Quaker buddies with you. And so when the Quakers went to Pennsylvania, the Quakers spread throughout the middle colonies. And not only did the Quakers spread throughout, but the Quaker attitude spread throughout. Come one, come all, everyone is welcome. And because everyone was welcome, everyone came. And people, the immigrants that moved into the middle colonies, a lot of them spent what little money they had left on a small piece of land to start a small farm. And if you remember, we kind of drew that picture, and people on these farms focus on growing just one type of crop, but you don't just want to eat one crop your whole lifetime. So the farmers would travel on their conestogas, their large covered wagons, into the market town. And there they would meet with other farmers and trade their crop for the crops of the other farmers. They would go to the different businesses like the blacksmith and the tailor and the cobbler and the general store, and they would use their crop kind of as money, because they don't have money, to get the goods and services they need from the businesses. They would also worship in the many different churches, depending upon what religion they followed, because remember, everybody's welcome there in the market town. So right now, you might realize that you like the way of life of the New England colonies better than the middle colonies or vice versa. But today we're going to talk about the southern colonies. And the southern colonies were quite different than the New England and the middle. First of all, there were 4 New England and 4 middle colonies. The southern colonies, there's actually 5 of them: Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And you can see the dates that they became colonies there. You can see Virginia was the first, we know that, and Georgia was the last. So the first and the last are both part of the southern colonies. So again, we already learned about the story of the very first southern colony. We spent a lot of time with our Sketch to Stretch learning about the settlement of Jamestown that started it all with Virginia. And we know that even though half died that first winter, we know that eventually the Native Americans taught them how to grow tobacco. And this became the big success. They never found the gold they were looking for, but growing tobacco was as valuable as gold. And they started to grow tobacco as something called a cash crop. Now, I would say in this section, this is probably one of the most important vocabulary words you need to know. So let's talk about what a cash crop is. Now, if you use your context clues and you use what you know, you've heard the word cash and you've heard the word crop. So if you put them together, then you might think that a cash crop, since cash means money and crop means plant, you might think that a cash crop is, well, a plant that grows money. Now that would be amazing and awesome, and it doesn't exist, because if it did, a lot of people that work would probably stop working. But that is not the real meaning of a cash crop. Instead, a cash crop is a crop that is grown to sell it and to make money off of it, not a crop you grow to use. So, like, I have a garden in my backyard, and this year I grew tomatoes and peppers and cucumbers. I grew those things so I can eat them. Those are not cash crops. But a cash crop is something that when you grow it, their entire purpose of growing it is simply to sell it all to make money. You're not growing it to eat it or use it yourself. So, some colonists who moved into the colonies hoped to use England's new land in the Americas to get rich simply by growing cash crops to sell and make money. So think about this for a minute. If you're someone that wants to move to the Americas simply to get rich off of growing cash crops, what type of person would be able to do this? What type of person? Well, I'm going to help you think through this one a little bit with me. All right, here we go. Think about this for a minute. The more cash crops you can grow, the more money you can make. The bigger the farm you have, the more cash crops you can grow. So, if you wanted to make more money from growing cash crops, you would want to buy a large piece of land for a huge farm. The bigger the farm, the more crops you can grow, the more crops you can grow, the more money you can make. So, we already know what we call a huge farm. This is actually another one of our big vocabulary words. We learned this when we learned about the Spanish and how they used their land in the Americas. If you remember, they were also growing cash crops on huge farms called, that's right, plantations. So think about this for a minute. If you wanted to get rich off of growing cash crops, you want to have enough money to be able to buy a huge piece of land to have one of these plantations so you can grow lots of cash crops. And what type of person would you have to be able to buy a huge piece of land? Well, you'd have to be a wealthy person that already has money. If you were one of the poor immigrants, like the kind that moved to the middle colonies, you wouldn't even have enough money to buy a large piece of land for a huge farm, a plantation to grow a lot of cash crops. So only wealthy people with a lot of money, had enough money to buy these huge farms or these plantations. So let's think about this for a minute. You're a wealthy person. You want to buy a huge piece of land to have a plantation. And the purpose is to grow as many cash crops as you can grow so you can sell them and make lots of money. So let's think about this. You're a wealthy person. You're moving into the Americas. Do you try to do this in the New England colonies, the middle colonies, or the southern colonies? Well, there's only one answer here, and I'm going to show it to you right here. That's your answer. Now, you might look at that and say, that's not an answer, Mrs. Phillips. That's some made-up gibberish word. It is not. What you're actually looking at, if you look carefully, is the months of the year. So if you look here, January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December. What I'm showing you guys here is the months of the year because I want to show you that depending upon where you are in the 13 colonies, the weather is very different. And because the weather is very different, the further north you are, the colder it is. The further north you are, the longer the winter it is. This is what I'm going to do to show you how long each year is a good time for growing crops. It's called the growing season. So if I show you in the New England colonies where it's colder because you're further from the equator, May, June, July, and August, there's really only a 4-month growing season, 4 months out of the year when crops will grow well, which means 8 months out of the year, you can't really grow crops, which means if you buy land and start a plantation up here to grow cash crops, you'll be growing cash crops for 4 months of the year. And for 8 months of the year, your plantation will go unused and you'll be making no money. That doesn't make any sense. Let's look to the middle colonies. It's a little bit warmer here in the middle colonies. The growing season is a little bit longer, from April to about September. That is a 6-month growing season. That means you can grow cash crops if you bought a plantation in the middle colonies for 6 months a year. But for the other 6 months a year, your plantation is useless and it's not making you any money. That doesn't make any sense. But take a look down here in the southern colonies. Take a look at the growing season of our southern colonies. It is not 4 months, it is not 6 months. You can be growing crops in a normal year from February until November, sometimes even from January to December. And so you have a 10-month growing season. That means 10 months a year, and sometimes even more, you could be growing crops on your plantation and making money. That's a big deal. So it only makes sense that if your goal is to grow cash crops on a plantation, the only place that makes sense to do this, if you are a wealthy person wanting to do this, would be down here in the southern colonies. And that's why you're going to have small farms where they're growing food to use themselves in the middle colonies. But if you want to grow cash crops, the only place to do that, the only place to have a plantation, if you are a wealthy colonist, is down in the southern colonies. So let's talk about kind of how the colonies came to be. We know Virginia became a successful colony because they were growing and selling the cash crop tobacco. And so what ends up happening is tobacco becomes this super valuable thing. So Virginia becomes this big money maker for England. And the King of England was like, hey, if we had more land, we could grow more tobacco and make more money. So the king decided to start a colony right near Virginia, just to the north, to provide England more space to grow more tobacco on tobacco plantations to sell and make more money. Maryland, by the way, was named after the Queen, Queen Mary, so it was Maryland. And that's essentially why Maryland became a colony, to give England more space to grow more tobacco to make more money. It's all about the money down here in the southern colonies. Now, in 1663, King Charles II, this is the same guy in the story of Pennsylvania, decided, man, we need more space to grow more cash crops. So he wanted to start another colony in the area to do that. And believe it or not, he made a ginormous colony. This colony went all the way from the bottom of Virginia all the way to where La Florida was, because remember, Florida was controlled by Spain. And he made this all one colony, one big one, and he named it after someone very important to him, himself, because in Latin, Charles is Caroline. And so he named it Carolina to honor himself. Now, here's the deal. Obviously, the king is way back in England, and it's hard for him to keep an eye on a colony far, far away. And so the king would send over kind of like a babysitter to each colony to kind of oversee the colonists, make sure things are going well. Carolina was just a really big colony, too big for one person to really look after. And so this colony will eventually get split up into smaller ones. We'll talk about that in a minute. So now that they have Carolina as a colony, they need to find a good cash crop to grow here. Well, there's only one cash crop that makes any sense to try because it's already making England a lot of money up in Virginia and Maryland, and that is tobacco. So they try growing tobacco in Carolina, but it doesn't really work growing down there. The soil isn't quite right. The temperature is a little bit too warm and too dry. So they find out pretty quickly tobacco isn't the best cash crop for this area. So they're going to go ahead and try some other things. The next thing they're going to try to grow is silk. Silk is super valuable. It's one of the riches of the Indies, but that didn't work because what they didn't realize is silk is made from silkworms, and the silkworms essentially poop out the silk threads, and just kind of a hot mess. That didn't work. They also tried to grow grapes. Grapes are great for making wine, but they found out grapes prefer much cooler temperatures and much richer soils, like up in Vinland in Canada where the Vikings were. So grapes are not a successful cash crop down here in what's called the Deep South. They did try growing cotton. Cotton is used to make cloth and clothing and blankets. And they actually found out that the Deep South was perfect for growing cotton. The soil was perfect, the temperature was perfect. But they quickly figured out cotton was not a good cash crop to grow. And here's why. When cotton grows, it doesn't grow in a nice soft cotton ball like you buy in a store. It actually grows like this. And what you're seeing here are these are seeds. And these seeds are sharp and sticky. And obviously, if you're going to want to turn cotton into a blanket or clothing, you don't want these sharp, sticky seeds in it. You're going to have to get those sharp, sticky seeds out. And the only way to do that during this time period was by hand, one by one by one. And so while cotton grew really well, it was so time consuming and it took so many workers to get those little seeds out before it was even usable that cotton wasn't the moneymaker they wanted. It was just took too much time, and time is money, to turn that cotton into something useful. And so finally, after a lot of trial and error, they figure out the best cash crop to grow down there, the most beneficial, was simple: rice, a great source of food. So rice became the main cash crop down here in Carolina. They also started to grow something else there in the Deep South, and that is something called indigo. Indigo is this beautiful purple petaled flower that when you took the petals and you ground it up with water, it would dye the clothing this beautiful purple or indigo color. And this was amazing because clothes back then were like drab and gray. Royalty, if you ever think about the color of royalty is, it's this purple color. This became a huge, important cash crop of the Deep South. In 1712, North Carolina and South Carolina were split off from this big chunk of land. And then they finally made Georgia that southern part of that. And Georgia was simply named after King George II. And so now that what was once Carolina becomes North Carolina and South Carolina, and down at the very bottom, Georgia. All right. The main cash crop grown in these three colonies that were once the Carolina colony is rice. And of course, the second most common was indigo, that beautiful plant. Unfortunately, we know that these plantations, these huge farms, require a lot of workers. And kind of like Spain, in the English colonies on the plantations, the colonists decided that they needed workers to work on some of these really big plantations. And who do you think they chose to get the work? Well, or to do the work? Kind of like in Spain, they did turn, to slaves. And they chose to go to Africa, like the Spanish did, and kidnap men, women, and children and buy slaves to work on their plantations. Now, not all plantations needed slaves. The bigger ones did. Some of the smaller ones were small enough that the families that purchased the land could do the work themselves. But on the bigger plantations, they did use slaves to do the planting and the harvesting and such on the plantations. So you do need to know this: the most grown cash crops in the Southern colonies, depending on where we're talking about, up in Virginia and Maryland, it was all about tobacco. But tobacco didn't grow well in the Deep South, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And so down here in the Deep South, it was all about rice and indigo. So this will be important. Important enough, we need to put it into our notes. So go ahead and get your notes open here and open to the Southern colonies. And let's fill this in. Many blank people moved to the Southern colonies and bought land to plant cash crops. The type of people that could afford these huge chunks of land for these plantations were the wealthy people. Very different than the middle colonies and the New England colonies. Finally, cash crops grown to sell, not to use, are called cash crops. I think I said that accidentally. Crops grown to sell and not to use are called cash crops because they're sold for cash. And the main cash crops in the Southern colonies were, of course, tobacco up in Maryland and Virginia. And then down in the deep south, rice. And it'll come when that goes away. Indigo, rice and indigo. Awesome, awesome, awesome. All right. In the next video, we are going to look closely at what life might have been like on a plantation.